When you lose your wife, sometimes your dog becomes your whole world. For 72-year-old Hank Morrison, finding his faithful companion Boone with a swollen face was like watching his last connection to happiness slip away. He rushed to the vet, expecting a simple diagnosis. Instead, Dr. Elise found something buried in his dog's jaw that shouldn't exist. It was Hank's old military dog tag from Vietnam, lost 50 years ago, along with his best friend, the same tag he watched disappear in the jungle during a firefight that still haunts his dreams. Boone had somehow found it and carried it home, in his mouth. But how did a piece of the past, buried half a world away, end up in rural Iowa? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock beside Hank Morrison's bed hadn't worked in 3 years, but he still woke at 5:30 every morning. Some habits die harder than the people who taught them to you. Margaret used to say he had an internal rooster, always up before dawn, always ready to greet the day with purpose. Now, in the quiet darkness of his farmhouse bedroom, Hank simply lay there for a moment, listening to Boone's steady breathing from the dog bed in the corner. On the nightstand sat a small velvet box that he never opened anymore. Inside, Margaret's wedding ring caught dust in the morning light that filtered through yellowed curtains. 52 years of marriage, reduced to a circle of gold he couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring himself to put away. Some mornings he'd reach for it, then pull his hand back like he'd touched a hot stove. "Come on, old boy," Hank said, swinging his legs out of bed. "Chores won't do themselves." Boone, a golden retriever with gray around his muzzle, stretched and yawned. At 8 years old, the dog moved with the same careful deliberation as his master. They were a matched pair, these two bachelors, going through the motions of living while remembering what it felt like to be truly alive. The farmhouse creaked as Hank moved through it, each floorboard singing a familiar tune. Margaret had wanted to replace them once, said they sounded like old bones settling. Now Hank found comfort in the noise. It meant the house was still standing, still holding memories in its walls, like pressed flowers in a book. In the kitchen, he started the coffee maker, an ancient percolator that Margaret had threatened to replace for decades. The rich aroma filled the air as Hank pulled on his work boots, the leather soft and molded to his feet from years of wear. Through the window, he could see the first hints of dawn touching the edges of his cornfield, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. This was Iowa, as God intended it. Rolling hills of black soil that could grow anything you asked of it, if you treated it with respect. Hank's family had farmed this land for 3 generations, and he'd planned to pass it on to his daughter Sarah. But Sarah lived in Chicago now, worked for some investment firm, wore suits that cost more than Hank, spent on groceries in a month. She called every Sunday, dutiful as clockwork. But their conversations felt like walking on ice, careful, polite, and always threatening to crack under the weight of things they never said. The morning routine was sacred. Feed the chickens, check the water troughs, walk the fence line. Boone followed at his heels, occasionally chasing after a rabbit or investigating interesting smells, but always returning to Hank's side. They were a team, united in their solitude. At 7:30, Hank drove his pickup into town for breakfast. At Millie's Diner. The truck was older than most people's children, but it started every morning and got him where he needed to go. That was enough. Millie's sat on Main Street between the hardware store and the post office, its neon sign flickering between pink and blue. The same booth waited for him every morning, second from the window, cracked vinyl patched with duct tape. Millie herself, 75 and tough as a railroad spike, poured his coffee before he sat down. "Morning, Hank. The usual?" "That'd be fine, Millie. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, bacon crisp enough to snap." He ate in comfortable silence, nodding to the other regulars. Tom from the grain elevator, Sheriff Martinez, old Pete who ran the barber shop until arthritis forced him to retire. These men understood the value of quiet companionship, the way shared presence could ease the burden of loneliness without requiring words. The talk this morning centered on weather and crops, the eternal concerns of farming communities. Corn, futures, the possibility of an early frost whose boy had made it to state championship in football. Safe topics that skimmed the surface of deeper waters, the way men of their generation preferred. Heard the Peterson place sold, Tom mentioned, stirring sugar into his coffee. City folks? Pete asked. Yep, planning to tear down the farmhouse, build something modern. Hank listened without contributing. Change was coming to their corner of Iowa, same as everywhere else. Young families moved away, seeking opportunities, and strangers moved in, seeking the peace they'd left behind. It was the way of the world, he supposed, but that didn't make it easier to watch. After breakfast, he stopped at Morrison Hardware, no relation, despite the name, to pick up fence wire and a new pair of work gloves. Bill Morrison, the owner, had been trying to retire for 5 years, but couldn't find anyone interested in buying a small-town hardware store. How's that dog of yours? Bill asked, ringing up the purchase. Good as gold. Keeps me honest. Dogs have a way of doing that. My Mary always said a man's only as good as his dog thinks he is. Hank nodded. Margaret used to say something similar. She'd loved Boone from the day Hank brought him home as a puppy, spoiling him with table scraps and letting him sleep on the furniture when she thought Hank wasn't looking. After she died, Boone seemed to understand he'd inherited the job of taking care of Hank. The dog watched him with intelligent brown eyes, as if measuring his mood, adjusting his behavior accordingly. The drive home took him past the Methodist church where Margaret was buried, its white steeple rising above oak trees planted by the town's founders. Hank didn't stop. He visited on Sundays after services, bringing fresh flowers from Margaret's garden, but he always slowed down, offering a silent greeting to the woman who'd shared his life for more than half a century. Back at the farm, he spent the afternoon mending fence and checking on the cattle. The work felt good, purposeful in a way that didn't require explanation. His hands knew what to do, muscle memory guiding him through tasks he'd performed thousands of times. Sweat and honest labor had a way of quieting the mind, pushing aside thoughts that served no purpose except to cause pain. Boone trotted alongside him, occasionally wandering off to investigate something interesting, but always returning when called. The dog had an easy confidence, secure in his place in the world. Hank envied that certainty sometimes. As evening approached, they walked the property line, a ritual Margaret had called taking inventory. She'd walk with them in those days, pointing out wildflowers or commenting on the changing seasons. Now Hank walked alone with his memories. The ghost of her voice carried on the wind that rustled through the corn. The sun was setting when they reached the back 40, where the field met a grove of oak trees that had stood since before the farm was established. Boone suddenly stopped, ears perked, nose working the air. He trotted toward the tree line, tail wagging with unusual excitement. "What is it, boy?" The dog disappeared into the underbrush, crashing through dried leaves with more energy than he'd shown in months. Hank followed, pushing aside branches, calling Boone's name. He found the dog digging frantically at the base of an old oak, dirt flying between his legs. "Come on, Boone, leave it be!" But the dog ignored him, something rare in their well-established hierarchy. Boone was usually the most obedient animal Hank had ever known, eager to please and quick to respond to commands. This behavior was completely out of character. "Boone!" The sharp command finally penetrated, and the dog reluctantly backed away from his excavation. His muzzle was covered in dirt, and he looked up at Hank with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. Whatever he'd been digging for remained hidden beneath the oak roots. They walked home in the gathering darkness, Boone unusually subdued. Hank heated a can of soup for dinner and shared half his sandwich with the dog, who seemed to have lost his appetite. By 9 o'clock, they were both ready for bed. The day's work complete, another 24 hours marked off the calendar of their quiet existence. Hank lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, the old furnace clicked on and off, and somewhere in the walls a mouse scurried about its business. These were the sounds of solitude, familiar as his own heartbeat. On the nightstand, Margaret's ring box caught a sliver of moonlight. 3 years since the cancer took her. 3 years of learning how to live alone after a lifetime of partnership. Some days were easier than others. Some days, he almost forgot she was gone, would turn to share something with her only to find empty space where she used to be. Boone shifted in his bed, making the soft whimpering sounds that meant he was dreaming. Hank wondered what dogs dreamed about, chasing rabbits perhaps, or running through fields with their owners. Simple pleasures, uncomplicated by regret or longing. In the darkness, Hank's own dreams waited, populated by faces from a different time, voices speaking languages he'd tried to forget. Vietnam was 50 years behind him, but some nights it felt like yesterday. Some nights the jungle came calling, bringing with it the sound of gunfire and the smell of fear. He'd learned to push those memories aside during daylight hours, to focus on the immediate concerns of farm life and leave the past where it belonged. But in the quiet hours before sleep, defenses weakened and ghosts walked freely through the rooms of memory. Tomorrow would bring another day of routine, another chance to find meaning in simple tasks. The alarm clock might not work, but Hank would wake at 5:30 anyway, ready to greet whatever the day had to offer. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he had, and he was determined to live it with as much grace as he could manage. Beside him, Boone settled into sleep, his breathing steady and peaceful. Whatever he'd been digging for in the Oak Grove could wait for another day. Some things, Hank had learned, revealed themselves in their own time, whether you were ready or not. The next morning brought trouble in the form of Boone's swollen face. Hank discovered it when he reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, a morning ritual as established as coffee and chores. The left side of Boone's muzzle had puffed up, like a balloon, and the dog's breathing sounded labored, whistling through narrowed passages. "Jesus, boy, what happened to you?" Boone looked up at him with apologetic eyes, as if the swelling was somehow his fault. His tail wagged weakly, but the usual enthusiasm was missing. When Hank offered him breakfast, the dog sniffed at his bowl but couldn't manage more than a few tentative licks. Panic rose in Hank's chest, sharp and immediate. In the 3 years since Margaret's death, Boone had become more than a pet. He was family, the only living thing that depended on Hank, that greeted him with unconditional joy every morning. The thought of losing him felt like standing at the edge of an abyss. The drive to the veterinary clinic took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Boone sat in the passenger seat, head resting against the window, his breathing increasingly labored. Hank kept one hand on the dog's back, feeling the rise and fall of his ribs, silently bargaining with whatever powers might be listening. Dr. Elise Patterson had opened her practice in town 6 months ago, fresh out of veterinary school and full of the kind of optimism that comes from believing you can fix anything. She was young, maybe 30, with short auburn hair and freckles that made her look even younger. The older farmers had been skeptical at first, accustomed to old Doc Henderson, who'd treated their animals for 40 years before retiring. But Dr. Elise had proven herself with gentle hands and sharp instincts. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, leading them into an examination room that smelled of antiseptic and hope. "Face swelled up overnight," Hank said, lifting Boone onto the examination table. "Can barely breathe." Dr. Elise's hands moved over Boone's face with practiced precision, her expression growing more puzzled by the moment. She checked his gums, looked into his throat, felt along his jaw and neck. "It's not an allergic reaction," she murmured, more to herself than to Hank. "And I don't see any evidence of a bite or sting. The swelling is very localized right here, along the jawline." She disappeared for a moment and returned with a small flashlight and what looked like a magnifying glass. Boone submitted to the examination with patient resignation, as if he understood the importance of cooperating. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need to sedate Boone and take some X-rays." There's something hard embedded in the tissue here, and I need to see exactly what we're dealing with." The waiting room felt like purgatory. Hank sat in a plastic chair that was too small for his frame, staring at posters of smiling cats and dogs while fighting the urge to pace. The magazines were months old, filled with articles about pet nutrition and training techniques that seemed trivial in the face of real crisis. An hour passed before Dr. Elise emerged from the back room, her expression unreadable. In her hand, she carried something small wrapped in gauze. "Mr. Morrison, I've removed the object that was causing the swelling. Boone is going to be fine. The sedation is wearing off and he's already breathing much easier." Relief flooded through Hank's chest, but Dr. Elise's expression suggested the story wasn't over. "What I found is, well, it's unusual." She unwrapped the gauze, revealing a piece of metal about the size of a silver dollar. It was green with corrosion, obviously old, but Hank could make out the embossed letters, Morrison, Henry J., his military dog tag, the one he'd lost in Vietnam 50 years ago. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Hank reached for the tag with shaking, hands feeling the familiar weight of it, the rough edges where shrapnel had nicked the metal during that last firefight. His service number was still legible, along with his blood type and the date of issue. 1971. "Mr. Morrison, are you all right?" Dr. Elise's voice seemed to come from very far away. Hank stared at the tag, his mind racing back to a jungle clearing where the screaming had finally stopped, where his best friend Tommy Chen had been there one moment and gone the next, swallowed by green hell and the confusion of war. "I lost this in Vietnam," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 50 years ago. That's impossible. How could it end up? I don't know." Hank looked up at her, seeing his own confusion reflected in her eyes. "I honestly don't." "No." The drive home passed in a blur. Boone sat beside him, the swelling already beginning to subside, but Hank barely noticed the dog's improvement. The tag felt hot in his pocket, as if it were radioactive with memory. Back at the farm, he led Boone directly to the oak grove where the dog had been digging the night before. In daylight, the excavation looked more extensive than Hank had realized. Boone had dug down almost 2 feet, exposing tree roots and dark earth that smelled of secrets. "Show me, boy, show me where you found it." Boone sniffed around the hole, then began digging again with renewed energy. His claws scraped against something metallic, and Hank dropped to his knees, pushing the dog aside gently. With his bare hands, he scooped away loose soil until he felt the edge of something buried. A metal box, military issue, green paint flaking away to reveal rust underneath. Hank's heart hammered as he worked it free from the earth. The latches had corroded shut, but a few sharp blows with a rock broke them open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job for 5 decades, was a military medical kit. The kind field medics carried in Vietnam, complete with bandages, morphine syrettes, and antiseptic that had long since crystallized into yellow chunks. But it was the photograph tucked into the lid that made Hank's breath catch. 2 young soldiers grinned at the camera, their arms around each other's shoulders. They wore the universal expression of men who believed they were immortal, who thought the war was an adventure that would end with them going home to tell stories to their grandchildren. One was Hank, 22 years old and lean as a whippet. The other was Tommy Chen, his best friend, his foxhole buddy, the closest thing to a brother he'd ever known. On the back of the photo, in Tommy's careful handwriting, "Hank and me, Firebase Charlie, March 1971, brothers forever." Hank's hands shook as he set the photo aside and continued examining the contents of the kit. There were letters, Tommy's letters to his family back in California, never sent, a St. Christopher medal, a small notebook filled with sketches of jungle scenes and cartoon drawings that had made them laugh during the long, terrifying nights. At the bottom of the kit, wrapped separately, was another dog tag. Not Hank's, but Tommy's. The metal was scratched and dented, but the name was clear, Chen Thomas M. "How?" Hank whispered to the empty grove. "How did this get here?" Boone whined softly. pressing against Hank's side as if sensing his distress. The dog's face was almost back to normal now, but his eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, as if he understood the significance of what they'd discovered. Hank sat back on his heels, surrounded by artifacts from a life he'd tried to forget. Tommy's belongings, buried in Iowa soil, discovered by a dog who couldn't possibly understand their significance. It made no sense. Tommy had disappeared during a firefight outside Chu Lai, his body never recovered. Hank had carried that guilt for 50 years, the knowledge that he'd failed to bring his friend home, that somewhere in Vietnam, Tommy's bones lay in unmarked jungle. But here was proof that Tommy had made it farther than anyone knew. Somehow, impossibly, a piece of him had found its way to Iowa, to Hank's own land, waiting all these years to be discovered. The sun was setting by the time Hank finally gathered the courage to return to the house. He carried the medical kit like it contained explosives, afraid that jarring it might make it disappear, might prove this was all some elaborate dream brought on by too much solitude and too many memories. In the kitchen, he spread Tommy's belongings. Across the table, each item a portal to the past. The photographs, the letters, the dog tag, physical evidence of a friendship that had ended in chaos and confusion, leaving questions that had haunted him for half a century. Boone settled at his feet, chin resting on Hank's boot. The dog's breathing was clear now, his face returning to its normal shape. Whatever force had compelled him to dig up the past had released its hold, leaving behind only the mysteries it had unearthed. Outside, darkness claimed the farm. But Hank barely noticed. He was 22 again, crouched in a foxhole with his best friend, making promises they were too young to understand they might not be able to keep. Sleep became a stranger that night. Every time Hank closed his eyes, the jungle returned with vivid clarity. The oppressive heat, the constant buzzing of insects, the way fear tasted like copper pennies in your mouth. He'd spent decades learning to lock those memories away, but Tommy's letters had blown the doors wide open. By 3 a.m, he gave up on rest and made his way to the kitchen table where Tommy's belongings waited in the lamplight. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the first letter, written on military stationery in Tommy's careful script. "Dear Mom and Dad," it began. "Hank says I should write about the good stuff, so here goes. We found a monkey yesterday that thinks it's a person. It sits up straight and watches us eat, like it's waiting for an invitation to dinner. Hank named it Charlie, after Charlie Chaplin, because it walks funny. We're not supposed to feed the wildlife, but between you and me, that monkey's been eating better than we have." Hank remembered that monkey. He remembered Tommy's laugh when it stole his helmet and wore it like a hat. He remembered thinking they'd have stories to tell their kids someday, adventures that would seem funny once they were safe at home. The letters painted a picture of 2 young men trying to find humor in hell, holding on to their humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Tommy wrote about the other soldiers, about the Vietnamese children who smiled despite everything, about his plans for after the war. "Hank invited me to visit his family's farm in Iowa," one letter read. "Says his mom makes the best apple pie in 3 counties, and his dad could use help with the corn harvest. I told him I don't know anything about farming, but he says that's okay. The land teaches you what you need to know. It sounds peaceful, Mom, like the opposite of here." Hank had to stop reading. The memory crashed over him like a wave. Tommy's excited voice in their foxhole, making plans for a future that got cut short 3 weeks later. They'd talked for hours about what they'd do when they got home, how Tommy would learn to drive a tractor, how they'd go fishing in the creek that ran through Hank's property. When dawn finally came, Hank felt like he'd lived through the war all over again. His hands shook as he made coffee, and Boone watched him with concerned brown eyes, sensing his distress. "I'm all right, boy," Hank lied, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Just tired." But he wasn't all right, and they both knew it. The nightmares he'd thought were buried had clawed their way back to the surface. bringing with them a crushing sense of guilt that felt as fresh as the day Tommy disappeared. At breakfast, Millie took one look at him and poured his coffee without her usual cheerful greeting. The other regulars nodded their hellos, but seemed to sense he needed space. Small towns had a way of respecting grief without making a fuss about it. Hank stared at his eggs until they grew cold. His appetite vanished. How was he supposed to explain what he'd found? How could he tell anyone that his dead friend's belongings had been buried on his property for 50 years, discovered by a dog who shouldn't have known they were there? "You look like hell, Hank." The voice belonged to Dr. Elise Patterson, sliding into the booth across from him without invitation. She wore jeans and a sweater instead of her veterinary coat, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence he'd noticed during Boone's examination. "Doc, didn't expect to see you here. It's a small town, not many breakfast options." She signaled Millie for coffee. "How's Boone doing?" "Better. The swelling's gone down." "Good. That was quite an unusual case." She paused, studying his face. "Have you had a chance to research that dog tag?" "I couldn't stop thinking about it." Hank felt heat rise in his cheeks. Of course she'd be curious. Finding a 50-year-old military tag embedded in a dog's jaw wasn't exactly routine veterinary medicine. "Some," he said carefully. "And?" Something in her tone made him look up. Really look at her, behind the professional concern. He saw genuine interest, not the morbid curiosity of someone wanting a good story to tell at parties. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." So he did. Sitting in Millie's diner over cooling coffee, Hank told Dr. Elise about Tommy Chen, about Vietnam, about the medical kit buried under the oak tree. He told her about the letters and the photograph, about plans made in a foxhole that never came to pass. She listened without interruption, her expression growing more amazed with each detail. When he finished, she sat back in the booth, shaking her head. "That's impossible," she said finally. "Your friend died in Vietnam. How could his belongings end up buried on your property?" "I don't know. I've been asking myself the same question all night." "Have you contacted the military, the VA? There might be records." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. "I'm not ready for that yet." Dr. Elise nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her eyes. "This is bringing back difficult memories." It wasn't a question, and Hank appreciated that she didn't treat it like one. He found himself wanting to tell her more, to share the weight of memories that had grown heavier with each passing year. "Tommy was the best of us," he said quietly. "Funny, smart, always looking out for the other guys. When he disappeared during that firefight, He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You blame yourself." Again, not a question. Hank stared into his coffee cup, seeing jungle shadows in the dark liquid. "I was supposed to watch his back. That was the deal we made. Never let each other face anything alone. But when the shooting started, everything went to hell. Smoke, confusion, people screaming. When it was over, Tommy was gone, just gone." "How long have you been carrying that guilt?" 50 years. Dr. Elise reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of comfort that didn't feel intrusive. "Survivor's guilt is common among veterans. Have you ever talked to anyone about it?" Margaret knew. She didn't push, but she knew something was eating at me. Used to have nightmares that would wake her up. She'd just hold me until they passed. Never asked for details. She sounds like a good woman. The best. Don't know how I got lucky enough to deserve her. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the diner humming with quiet conversation around them. Hank found himself studying Dr. Elise's face, noting the intelligence in her green eyes, the way her presence seemed to calm something restless. Inside him, "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. "I don't know. Part of me wants to bury that box again, pretend I never found it. But you won't. No. I owe Tommy more than that. I owe him the truth, whatever that turns out to be." Dr. Elise smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since she'd sat down. "If you need help with research, with contacting the right people, I'd be glad to assist. I have some experience with military records from my father's service." "Why?" The in question seemed to surprise her. She considered it for a moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. Because some mysteries are meant to be solved, because carrying guilt for 50 years is too long for anyone, and because I think your friend Tommy would want you to find peace. Outside, the Iowa morning was bright and clear, full of the promise that came with autumn air and changing leaves. But inside Hank's chest, something dark and heavy had begun to shift, like ice breaking up on a river after a long winter. For the first time in 50 years, he wasn't facing his ghosts alone. The phone call came on a Thursday evening, while Hank was reading another of Tommy's letters by lamplight. The familiar Chicago area code made his stomach clench. Sarah only called outside their Sunday routine when something was wrong. "Dad?" "Doctor, Patterson called me today." Hank set down the letter carefully, his daughter's voice carrying the sharp edge of concern mixed with frustration that he'd heard too many times since Margaret's funeral. "Did she now? She's worried about you. Says, you've been having some kind of episode about Vietnam." "It's not an episode, Sarah. It's complicated." "Then uncomplicated for me, because I'm getting in my car tomorrow morning, and I'm driving down there to see what's going on." The threat of Sarah's visit should have brought comfort, but instead it filled Hank with dread. His daughter approached problems like the financial analyst she was, with spreadsheets and action plans and an unwavering belief that every issue had a solution if you just applied enough logic to it. "You don't need to do that." "The hell I don't. Dad, you haven't been yourself since Mom died, and now you're apparently digging up military artifacts in the backyard. Dr. Patterson says you found some friends' belongings from the war. How is that even possible?" Hank closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of expectations he'd never learned to carry. Sarah had always been brilliant, driven, impatient with anything that couldn't be quantified or explained. The idea of trying to make her understand the mystery of Tommy's buried past felt exhausting. "I'll explain when you get here." "Damn right. You will." She hung up without saying goodbye, a habit that reminded him painfully of Margaret during their few serious arguments. Strong women, both of them, but sometimes strength looked a lot like stubbornness. Boone lifted his head from his bed, sensing the tension in the room. The dog's face had returned to normal, but his behavior had changed since the discovery. He spent more time staring toward the oak grove, as if listening for something only he could hear. "Looks like we're getting company, boy." The next morning brought autumn in earnest, crisp air that turned breath to vapor and painted the leaves in shades of fire. Hank was splitting wood behind the barn when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Sarah's BMW looked out of place in the farmyard, sleek and black among the practical trucks and tractors. She emerged wearing designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people spent on a month of groceries. At 42, Sarah had inherited her mother's beauty and her father's stubborn jaw, though she'd learned to soften both behind professional makeup and carefully styled hair. "Dad." She kissed his cheek, her perfume mixing with the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. "You look tired. Haven't been sleeping well, so I gathered. Where's this mysterious box Dr. Patterson mentioned? Always straight to business, just like her mother used to do when she wanted answers." Hank led her inside, where Tommy's belongings still covered the kitchen table like evidence in a crime that had no victim. Sarah examined each item with the methodical attention she brought to financial reports. The letters, the photographs, the dog tags, she handled them with respect, but without the emotional weight they carried for Hank. "This is definitely unusual," she admitted, studying the photograph of the two young soldiers. "You look so young." "Dad, I've never seen pictures of you from the war. Your mother had a few. I put them away after she died." "Why?" The simple question carried decades of subtext. Why had he never talked about his service? Why had he always changed the subject when she asked about his time in Vietnam? Why had he built walls around that part of his life, even with his own family? Some things are better left buried. Apparently not, if they keep digging themselves. Up. Sarah set down the photograph and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the oak grove where Boone had made his discovery. Her shoulders held the rigid posture she'd inherited from Margaret. Spine straight, chin up, ready to face whatever needed facing. "Tell me about him." "Tommy." So Hank did. He told her about meeting Tommy at basic training, about their friendship that had grown in the crucible of shared fear and mutual dependence. He told her about Tommy's dreams of becoming a teacher, about his skill with sketches that made their squad laugh during the worst moments. He was going to visit after the war, Hank said, his voice growing rough. "I'd invited him to help with harvest, maybe stay through Christmas. Your mother was excited about meeting him. I'd written about him in my letters home, but he never made it. Disappeared during a firefight outside Chulai, March 15th, 1971. His body was never recovered." Sarah turned from the window, her expression softer than he'd seen it in years. "That's why you never talked about the war. You were grieving. I was supposed to protect him. We'd made a pact. Brothers forever, watch each other's backs. I failed. Him, Sarah. When it mattered most, I failed. Dad, I can still hear him calling my name when the shooting started. I can still see the look on his face when I lost sight of him in the smoke. 50 years, and I can still—" His voice broke, the words refusing to come. Sarah crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides and wrapped her arms around him, the same fierce hug she'd given him as a child when thunder scared her during storms. For a moment, she was 6 years old again, and he was the father who could fix anything with patience and love. "You didn't fail him," she said firmly. "You survived a war, came home, built a life. You married Mom, raised me, ran this farm for 50 years. Tommy would be proud of what you accomplished. How can you be sure?" "Because I read his letters. He writes about you like you hung the moon, Dad. Whatever happened in that firefight, he knew you'd tried to save him." They stood in the kitchen holding each other while autumn light streamed through the windows, illuminating Tommy's scattered belongings. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor worked the fields, and life continued its ancient rhythm despite the mysteries that surfaced to disturb the peace. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked finally. "We find out what really happened to Tommy Chen. We find out how his belongings ended up buried on our land. And we give him the homecoming I promised him 50 years ago." Sarah pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. If you're willing, this might get complicated." She smiled, the same smile Margaret used to give him when he was being particularly dense about something obvious. "Dad, I've been waiting my whole life for you to let me help you with something that actually mattered. Of course I'm willing." Outside, Boone began barking at something only he could see. Through the window, Hank watched the dog race toward the Oak Grove, tail wagging with excitement as if greeting an old friend who'd finally come home. Sarah attacked the mystery of Tommy Chen with the same methodical precision she brought to analyzing investment portfolios. Within 2 days, she'd transformed Hank's kitchen table into a command center, complete with her laptop, printed military records, and a timeline that stretched across 3 sheets of poster board. "The good news is that your friend Tommy was officially listed as missing in action, not killed in action," she announced over breakfast, scrolling through documents on her screen. "That means there might be more records available through different channels." Hank sipped his coffee and tried to process the implications. For 50 years, he'd carried the certainty of Tommy's death like a stone in his chest. The possibility that his friend might have survived, even briefly, felt both hopeful and terrifying. What's the bad news? MIA cases from Vietnam are notoriously complex. Thousands of soldiers were never accounted for, and the records from that period are often incomplete or contradictory. Dr. Elise arrived as they were discussing next steps, bringing fresh pastries from the bakery and an infectious enthusiasm. For their investigation, she'd taken to stopping by each morning, ostensibly to check on Boone's recovery, but clearly invested in solving the mystery that had brought them together. "Any luck with the Veterans Administration?" she asked, settling into a chair with her own cup of coffee. "I called yesterday," Sarah replied. "They confirmed Tommy's MIA status, but accessing his complete file requires next-of-kin authorization or special circumstances. What counts as special circumstances? New evidence related to his disappearance, physical artifacts, witness testimony, anything that might help locate his remains or clarify his fate. Hank gestured toward the medical kit and its contents. Seems like that box would qualify. You'd think so, but bureaucracy doesn't always follow logic. The VA representative I spoke with suggested contacting the Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command. They're specifically tasked with investigating these cases. The conversation was interrupted by Boone's excited barking from the backyard. Through the kitchen window, they could see him standing over a fresh hole near the oak grove, his tail wagging furiously. "Not again," Hank muttered, pushing back from the table. They found Boone digging with renewed enthusiasm, dirt flying between his legs, as he worked to excavate something metallic from the earth. This time, it was Sarah who knelt beside the hole and worked the object free, a tarnished bronze star suspended from a faded ribbon. "Is this what I think it is?" she asked, holding the medal up to catch the morning light. Dr. Elise examined it, carefully, her veterinary training giving her experience with detailed observation. Bronze star medal with V device for valor. The inscription on the back reads, "For heroic achievement in ground combat against a hostile force." Hank's hands shook as he took the medal. The name engraved on the back was clear despite the corrosion. "Chen Thomas M. Tommy earned a bronze star," Sarah said quietly. "Dad, this means he did something extraordinary before he disappeared." The medal felt impossibly heavy in Hank's palm, weighted with implications he wasn't ready to face. If Tommy had been decorated for heroism, it meant his final actions had been witnessed and documented. It meant there were official records somewhere, reports that might explain how his belongings had ended up buried in Iowa soil. "We need to contact that JPAC office," Dr. Elise said. "This changes everything." That afternoon, Sarah made the call while Hank sat on the front porch with Boone, staring across the fields that had been his refuge for so many years. The familiar landscape felt different now, charged with secrets that refused to stay buried. "I spoke with a Colonel Martinez," Sarah reported when she emerged from the house. "He's very interested in Tommy's case, especially given the physical evidence we've recovered. He's sending someone to interview you next week." "What kind of interview?" "They want to hear your first-hand account of Tommy's disappearance. Any details? You remember about that day, the unit you were serving with, the location of the firefight. They're also arranging for a forensic examination of the artifacts." Hank nodded, though the thought of reliving that day in official detail made his stomach clench. For decades, he'd worked to forget the specifics. The sound of gunfire, the smell of cordite, the moment he'd realized Tommy was gone. Now he was being asked to remember everything with perfect clarity. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "Colonel Martinez gave me contact information for Tommy's family. His parents died years ago, but he has a nephew in California, David Chen. The colonel thought we might want to reach out to him directly." What would I say? "Hello, I'm the man who failed to save your uncle 50 years ago, but I found his medals buried in my backyard." Dr. Elise, who had been quietly listening from the porch railing, spoke up. "You could start by telling him that Tommy talked about him in his letters, that he loved his family and wanted to come home to them." She was right, of course. Tommy's letters were full of references to his nephew, the little boy who would be middle-aged now, who had grown up wondering what happened to his uncle in the jungles of Vietnam. That evening, after Dr. Elise had gone home, and Sarah had retreated to her childhood bedroom to make more phone calls, Hank sat alone in the kitchen, rereading Tommy's correspondence. The letters painted a picture of a young man who believed in justice, who treated his fellow soldiers with kindness, who faced each day with courage despite the circumstances. One letter, dated just a week before Tommy's disappearance, contained a passage that made Hank's breath catch. "If something happens to me over here, I want you to know that Hank Morrison is the best man I've ever known. He's saved my life 3 times already. and I'd trust him with anything. If I don't make it home, tell my family that I died fighting alongside my brother. That's what he is to me, Mom. The brother I never had." Hank read the passage 3 times. Before setting the letter aside, his vision blurred by tears he'd held back for 50 years. Tommy had forgiven him in advance for any failure, had seen him as a hero, even when Hank saw himself as a coward. Outside, the October wind rustled through the oak leaves, carrying with it the promise of winter and the certainty that some secrets, once unearthed, could never be buried again. In the distance, a phone rang in Sarah's room as she continued her methodical investigation, determined to solve a mystery that had haunted her father for longer than she'd been alive. The medal sat on the kitchen table beside Tommy's other belongings, catching the lamplight like a fallen star. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new questions, new challenges to the narrative Hank had constructed around his guilt and grief. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he felt the stirring of something that might eventually become peace. The call to David Chen took 3 attempts. Twice, Hank hung up before the phone finished ringing, his courage failing him at the last moment. On the 3rd try, Sarah stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder, and he forced himself to let it ring. "Hello?" The voice was pleasant, professionally warm, the kind of tone that suggested David Chen was accustomed to handling difficult conversations with grace. "Mr. Chen? This is Henry Morrison. I served with your Uncle Tommy in Vietnam." The silence stretched long enough that Hank wondered if the call had dropped. Then David's voice returned, changed now, weighted with decades of questions, finally finding their way toward answers. "I never thought I'd hear from anyone who knew Uncle Tommy. My family. We never learned what happened to him. That's why I'm calling. It's complicated, but I think I might have some information that could help." They talked for an hour. David was a high school principal in Sacramento, married with 2 teenage daughters who'd grown up hearing stories about their great-uncle who disappeared in the war. He listened without interruption as Hank explained about Boone's discovery, about the buried medical kit and the Bronze Star Medal. "I have some of his letters," David said when Hank finished. "The ones he sent home before he went missing. He wrote about you, said you were like a brother to him." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. Tommy had written to his family about their friendship, had shared their bond with people who would remember it long after the war ended. "He was the best of us," Hank said, his voice rough. "I should have protected him." "Mr. Morrison, Hank, from everything my uncle wrote, it sounds like you tried. Whatever happened over there, my family doesn't blame you. We're just grateful that someone cared enough about him to keep looking for answers." David asked if he could fly to Iowa to meet them in person, to see Tommy's belongings and hear the full story. Sarah immediately invited him to stay at the farm, her natural hospitality overriding her father's protests about putting people out. "Dad, this man has been wondering about his uncle his entire life. The least we can do is offer him a place to stay." The next morning brought another discovery. Boone led them to a different spot in the oak grove, where his enthusiastic digging revealed a corroded metal film canister buried beneath layers of decaying leaves. Sarah worked it open carefully, revealing a roll of black and white film that had somehow survived 5 decades underground. "How is this possible?" Dr. Elise marveled, examining the canister in the morning light. "Film doesn't usually preserve this well in soil conditions." "The canister was airtight," Sarah observed, "and the oak grove stays relatively dry compared to other parts of the property. Still, it's remarkable that anything survived." They drove to the camera shop in the county seat, where the elderly owner examined the film with the reverence of someone who understood its historical significance. He explained that developing 50-year-old film was tricky. The emulsion might have degraded, the images might be too faded to make out, or the entire roll might be blank. "But we'll give it our best shot," he promised. "Check back tomorrow." Afternoon. That evening, Hank found himself in the barn, sorting through boxes of Margaret's belongings that he'd never been able to face. Sarah had suggested they make room for David's visit by clearing out the guest room, but Hank suspected she had ulterior motives. She'd been encouraging him to deal with Margaret's things since the funeral. In a box labeled Hank's Military, he found items Margaret had saved without his knowledge. His dress uniform, carefully preserved in plastic, his combat boots, cleaned and polished, a manila envelope containing letters he'd sent home from Vietnam, his own handwriting strange and young on the aged paper, reading his own words from 50. Years ago was like looking through a window into another life. The young man who'd written these letters was optimistic despite the circumstances, certain that he and Tommy would come through the war together, make it home to build the lives they'd planned. "Found something interesting?" Sarah asked from the barn doorway. "Your mother saved everything, even things I thought were lost." Sarah settled beside him on a hay bale, picking up one of his letters. "She loved you, Dad. She wanted to preserve every part of your life, even the parts you couldn't talk about." I should have told her more about Tommy. She would have understood. She did understand. Maybe not the details, but she understood that you'd lost someone important over there. They worked together in comfortable silence, sorting through memories that Margaret had kept safe for decades. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, Hank found something that made his breath catch, a small wooden cross, rough carved, with TC carved into the crosspiece. "I made this for Tommy's grave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but there was no grave to put it on. I brought it home and forgot about it." Sarah took the cross, tracing the carved letters with her finger. "We could put it on his headstone when we find out where he's buried. If he's buried. For all we know, his body was never recovered. The artifacts have to mean something, Dad. They didn't bury themselves." The next afternoon, they returned to the camera shop with nervous anticipation. The owner emerged from his darkroom with a manila envelope and an expression that mixed amazement with professional pride. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, spreading the developed photographs across his counter. "The images are remarkably clear for their age." The photographs were combat shots, the kind taken by military photographers to document operations. But these weren't official images. They were personal, candid shots of soldiers during quieter moments. Hank recognized several faces, including his own, looking impossibly young in jungle fatigues, but it was the final image that stopped his heart. The photograph showed two figures in a jungle clearing, one soldier carrying another on his back while enemy fire erupted around them. Even after 50 years, even through the grain and shadows of black and white film, Hank could identify both. Men clearly, he was carrying Tommy Chen to safety. "That's you," Sarah breathed, pointing at the soldier bearing his friend's weight. "Dad, that's you saving Tommy." The photograph contradicted everything Hank had believed about that day. In his memory, he'd lost sight of Tommy in the chaos, had failed to reach him when it mattered most, but here was proof that he'd found his friend, had risked his own life to carry him away from the firefight. "I don't understand," he said, staring at the image. "I remember it differently. I remember failing." Dr. Elise, who had come with them to see the photographs, touched his arm gently. "Trauma can distort memory, Hank. Sometimes our minds remember our fears instead of what actually happened." The evidence was undeniable. Whatever had occurred after this photograph was taken, Hank had not abandoned his friend. He had done exactly what he'd promised to do. Watched Tommy's back, risked everything to bring him home. But if Tommy had survived the firefight long enough to be carried to safety, what had happened next? How had he ended up missing, presumed dead, while his belongings made their way to Iowa soil? The photograph raised as many questions as it answered, but for the first time in 50 years, Hank began to believe that the truth might be something he could live with. David Chen arrived on a crisp Monday morning, driving a rental car that looked as out of place in Hank's farmyard as Sarah's BMW had a week earlier. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When he stepped out of the car and looked across the Iowa landscape, his expression held the same wonder Hank had seen in Tommy's letters, the amazement of a California boy encountering the endless horizons of the Midwest. "So this is the place Tommy dreamed about visiting," David said, accepting Hank's handshake with both hands. "He wrote that Iowa was God's country, where the soil was black as coffee and the corn grew taller than a man. He had a poet's way of seeing things," Hank replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "Always found beauty where the rest of us just saw work." Sarah emerged from the house with coffee and her usual direct approach to complicated situations. Within minutes, she had David settled at the kitchen table, examining Tommy's belongings with the reverence of someone handling sacred relics. "My grandmother kept his room exactly as he'd left it until she died in 1995, David said, studying the photograph of the two young soldiers. "She never stopped believing he'd come home someday." "What did the family know about his disappearance?" Dr. Elise asked. She'd become an unofficial member of their investigation team, her medical background proving useful for interpreting military documents, and her calm presence providing stability for everyone involved. Very little. The official notification said he was missing in action following enemy contact near Chu Lai. His commanding officer wrote that Tommy had displayed exceptional courage under fire, but his body couldn't be recovered due to hostile activity in the area. Hank nodded grimly. It was a familiar story. Too many good soldiers had simply vanished in the jungle, leaving their families with nothing but form letters and unanswered questions. "That's why this is so important," Sarah said, gesturing toward the bronze star. Medal. These artifacts prove that Tommy's story didn't end when the military said it did. They spent the morning sharing stories and examining evidence. David had brought copies of Tommy's letters home, and comparing them with the unsent letters from the medical kit revealed a complete picture of his final weeks. Tommy had been optimistic about the war ending, excited about his plans to visit Iowa, deeply concerned about the younger soldiers in their unit. "He sounds like he was a natural leader," Dr. Elise observed, reading one of his descriptions of helping a homesick private write letters home. He was. The guys looked up to him, even though he wasn't the oldest or highest ranking. He had a gift for making people feel valued. That afternoon, Colonel Martinez arrived from the Joint POW MIA Accounting Command, bringing with him a forensic specialist and enough official documentation to fill Sarah's laptop bag twice over. Martinez was a career officer with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades dealing with the aftermath of war, but his manner was gentle when he interviewed Hank about Tommy's disappearance. "Take your time, Mr. Morrison. I know this is difficult, but any detail you remember could be crucial." Hank described that day in March 1971 as clearly as he could, aided by the combat photograph that had restored some of his suppressed memories. The firefight had started at dawn, a coordinated attack that caught their patrol in open ground. Tommy had been hit early, shrapnel in his leg, but he'd continued fighting until Hank reached him. "I carried him to a defensive position behind some fallen trees." He was conscious, talking, worried about the other guys. "That's the last clear memory I have of him. Tommy trying to convince me to leave him and help the others." "But you didn't leave him?" "No. At least I don't think I did. Everything after that is confused. More gunfire, explosions, smoke everywhere. When the dust settled, I was at an aid station, and Tommy was gone." Colonel Martinez made careful notes, asking follow-up questions that helped Hank piece together details he'd buried for decades. The forensic specialist examined each artifact with scientific precision, photographing everything and taking samples for laboratory analysis. "These items are definitely from the Vietnam era," she confirmed. "The corrosion patterns are consistent with long-term burial in Midwest soil conditions. But I'm puzzled by the preservation. Usually, organic materials like leather and fabric don't survive this well." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. "It suggests these items were buried relatively recently, not 50 years ago. Maybe 10 or 15 years at most." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Tommy's belongings hadn't been buried for 5 decades, then someone had put them there much more recently. Someone who had access to authentic military artifacts from Vietnam and knowledge of their significance to Hank. Could someone have faked this? David asked quietly. Created some kind of elaborate hoax? Colonel Martinez shook his head. The dog tags are genuine. We can verify the serial numbers. The Bronze Star is authentic military issue from the correct period. These aren't replicas. Then how? The colonel held up his hand, his expression grave. Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you some specific questions about military records. Have you ever requested information about Thomas Chen through official channels? No, I tried to forget about the war, not research it. Has anyone in your family requested information? Not until this week, when Sarah started calling the VA. Colonel Martinez exchanged glances with his forensic specialist, some unspoken communication. Passing between them. Mr. Morrison, we ran Thomas Chen's name through our database yesterday, cross-referencing it with recent burial records. We found something you need to know. The colonel opened a manila folder and withdrew an official document, a military transport manifest dated 15 years earlier. In 2009, remains identified as belonging to Thomas M. Chen were repatriated from Vietnam and shipped to the United States for burial. According to these records, he's interred at Graceland Cemetery in Fairfield, Iowa. Hank felt the world tilt sideways. Fairfield was 20 miles from his farm. He'd driven past Graceland Cemetery hundreds of times over the years. Tommy had been buried in Iowa soil all along, while Hank carried the guilt of leaving him in a foreign jungle. That's impossible, Sarah said, her analyst's mind rejecting information that didn't fit her carefully constructed timeline. If Tommy was buried in 2009, how did his belongings end up on Dad's property? Colonel Martinez referred to another document, his expression growing more troubled. That's where things get complicated. The remains buried at Graceland were initially misidentified. According to this correction notice filed just last month, the body in Thomas Chen's grave actually belongs to another soldier, Private James McKinney from Minnesota. You're saying they buried the wrong person? Dr. Elise asked. It happens more often than we'd like to admit. When remains are recovered decades after death, identification can be extremely challenging. DNA testing has helped us correct many errors, but it's an ongoing process. David leaned forward, his voice tight with emotion. Where is my uncle really buried? Colonel Martinez turned to another page in the file, and Hank saw something in his expression that suggested the biggest revelation was yet to come. That's what we need to determine. But based on these artifacts and their location, combined with the administrative error at Graceland Cemetery, I believe Thomas Chen's actual remains may have been buried much closer to home than anyone realized. He paused, looking directly at Hank. Mr. Morrison, have you ever visited the grave of James McKinney at Graceland Cemetery? I don't know anyone named McKinney, but you might know the grave. According to cemetery records, you've been leaving flowers at that particular site every Sunday for the past 15 years. The room spun around Hank as understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. The unmarked grave he'd been visiting since Margaret's death, the one that had always felt peaceful somehow, the place where he'd found solace in his grief. It had been Tommy all along. His best friend had been buried 20 miles from the farm, waiting patiently under the wrong name for Hank to find him, and somehow, impossibly, Boone had known. The drive to Graceland Cemetery took place in stunned silence. 4 adults and 1 dog packed into Hank's pickup truck, each lost in their own thoughts about the impossible revelation that had turned 50 years of assumption upside down. The autumn afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made Iowa look like a painting, but Hank barely noticed the scenery that usually brought him peace. He'd been visiting Tommy's grave for 15 years without knowing it. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill overlooking farmland that stretched to the horizon, its weathered headstones and ancient oaks creating an atmosphere of timeless serenity. Hank knew the path by heart, 3rd row from the main gate, halfway down the hill, beneath the spreading branches of a maple tree that turned scarlet every October. The headstone was simple granite, worn smooth by weather and time. James McKinney, 1949-1971, beloved son and brother. Below the inscription, someone had carved a small cross, and at the base of the stone sat a mason jar filled with fresh wildflowers, the same flowers Hank had been bringing every Sunday since Margaret died. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying on the autumn wind. "This is where I've been coming." David Chen knelt beside the grave, his hands trembling as he touched the headstone. "Uncle Tommy," he whispered, "I've been looking for you my whole life." Dr. Elise examined the flowers with her practiced eye for detail. "These are from your property, aren't they? The black-eyed Susans and prairie grass, they're the same varieties that grow wild in your oak grove." Hank nodded, the connections becoming clearer even as the mystery deepened. For 15 years, he'd been drawn to this particular grave without understanding why. He'd told himself it was because the stone was unmarked with visitors, that someone should remember the unknown soldier buried beneath it. But now he realized it had been something deeper, some instinct or intuition that recognized the presence of his lost friend. "We need to arrange for proper identification," Colonel Martinez said, making notes on his official pad. "DNA testing, and dental records if they exist, formal verification. The process will take several months, but we can expedite it given the circumstances." "What about James McKinney?" Sarah asked. "His family deserves to know where he's actually buried." "We're working on that. Based on preliminary research, Private McKinney's remains were likely interred at the military cemetery in Minnesota, where his family requested burial. We'll need to conduct similar testing there to confirm." The implications were staggering. 2 families had spent decades grieving at the wrong graves. 2 young soldiers had been separated from their true resting places by bureaucratic error and the chaos of war. How many other misidentifications existed? How many other families were visiting strangers while their loved ones lay beneath unfamiliar names? Back at the farm that evening, they gathered around the kitchen table to plan the memorial service that would finally give Tommy Chen the homecoming Hank had promised him 50 years ago. The artifacts that Boone had discovered would be displayed with honor, each item telling part of the story of a young man who died far from home but had somehow found his way to the place he'd dreamed of visiting. "I'd like to invite the American Legion Post," Dr. Elise suggested, "and the VFW chapter. Tommy deserves a military honor guard." "The whole town will want to come," Sarah added. "This story has been spreading through the community like wildfire. People are calling it a miracle." David had been quiet throughout the planning, studying the photographs of his uncle with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. Finally he looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want to read one of his letters at the service," he said. "The one where he writes about coming to Iowa, about the dreams he had for after the war. His voice should be part of this ceremony." Hank felt his throat tighten. The idea of Tommy's own words being read aloud, of his voice somehow present at his own memorial, seemed fitting in a way that transcended explanation. "There's something else we should include," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the wooden cross he'd carved 50 years ago, the one Margaret had saved in the box of his military belongings. "I made this for Tommy's grave back in 1971. Never had a chance to use it." The simple cross, worn smooth by decades of handling, seemed to embody everything that had been lost and found again. The rough carving of TC was still visible, testimony to a young soldier's grief and love for his fallen friend. "We'll place it on his headstone during the ceremony," Colonel Martinez promised, along with his corrected military honors. That night, Hank sat on his front porch with Boone at his feet, watching the stars emerge over the Iowa landscape. The dog had been unusually calm since their visit to the cemetery, as if some restless energy had finally been satisfied. Whatever force had compelled him to dig in the oak grove had completed its work. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" Hank said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Somehow you knew Tommy was out there, waiting for us to find him." Sarah emerged from the house with 2 cups of coffee and settled into the chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter finally sharing the weight of memories that had shaped both their lives in different ways. "Mum would have loved this," Sarah said eventually. "She always believed that things happened for a reason, that love was stronger than death. Your mother was a wise woman, smarter than me about most things. She knew you were carrying something heavy. From the war, she used to worry that you'd never find peace with it." Hank thought about Margaret, about the way she'd held him during the nightmares, never pushing for details, but always offering comfort. She'd understood instinctively that some wounds needed time to heal, that love was sometimes expressed through patient silence rather than demanding words. "I think she'd be proud of what we're doing," he said. "Bringing Tommy home properly, giving his family closure. It feels like something she would have wanted." The memorial planning consumed the next several days. Sarah coordinated with local officials. Dr. Elise handled media requests from newspapers and television stations, and David worked with his family in California to arrange travel for relatives who wanted to attend. Word of Tommy's story had spread beyond the local community, capturing the attention of veterans groups and military families across the country. Colonel Martinez returned with updates on the identification process. Preliminary DNA results from bone samples taken from the grave confirmed what they'd all suspected. The remains buried as James McKinney were indeed those of Thomas M. Chen. Official verification would take several more weeks, but the evidence was conclusive enough to proceed with the memorial ceremony. "We've also located James McKinney's actual burial site," the colonel reported. "He's been resting at Fort Snelling National Cemetery in Minnesota, where his family requested interment. His relatives will be notified this week, and arrangements will be made for proper identification of his grave." The ceremony was scheduled for the following Saturday, giving family members time to travel and allowing the community to prepare for what had become the largest memorial service in the town's history. The Methodist Church had offered their sanctuary, the American Legion had volunteered an honor guard, and the local high school band had agreed to play taps. Hank spent the week writing his eulogy, struggling to find words that could capture 50 years of grief, guilt, and love. How do you summarize a friendship that was cut short before it could fully bloom? How do you explain the weight of carrying someone's memory when you believed you'd failed them? On Friday evening, the night before the ceremony, he sat at his kitchen table with the final draft, reading it aloud to Boone and Sarah. The words felt inadequate, but they came from the heart. A soldier's tribute to his fallen brother, a friend's promise finally fulfilled. Outside, cars were already arriving in town for the next day's service. The motel was fully booked, and families were opening their homes to visitors who had traveled hundreds of miles to honor a young man they'd never met, but whose story had touched their hearts. Tommy Chen was finally coming home to Iowa, not as the visitor he'd planned to be, but as an honored guest whose presence would be celebrated by an entire community that had adopted him as their own. The Methodist Church had never held so many people. Every pew was filled, with folding chairs lining the aisles and mourners standing 3 deep along the walls. Veterans from 3 wars had come to honor one of their own, their dress uniforms, and service pins, creating a tapestry of American military history. Local farmers sat beside visiting dignitaries, children pressed close to grandparents, and reporters balanced cameras with respectful discretion. At the front of the sanctuary, a display table held Tommy's artifacts with museum-quality care. The bronze star gleamed under the soft light, flanked by his letters, his medical kit, and the combat photograph that had revealed the truth about Hank's heroism. The wooden cross sat beside his official military portrait, a young man's face, full of hope and determination, forever frozen in time. Hank sat in the front pew beside David Chen and his family, his hands folded around the pages of his eulogy. Sarah sat on his other side, elegant in her black dress, her presence a source of strength he'd never expected to need. Dr. Elise had positioned herself where he could see her from the podium, her encouraging smile a lifeline in the sea of faces. The service began with the American Legion Honor Guard presenting the colors, their movements precise and reverent. The high school band played the Star-Spangled Banner, and 500 voices joined in singing, the harmony rising to the wooden rafters like a prayer. Pastor Williams, who had officiated at Margaret's funeral 3 years earlier, spoke about the mystery of divine timing, about how some stories took decades to unfold, but always led toward healing and reconciliation. His words were gentle but powerful, acknowledging the pain of loss while celebrating the miracle of discovery. Then it was David's turn to read from his uncle's letters. He approached the podium with the careful dignity of an educator accustomed to holding an audience's attention, but his voice broke slightly as he began. This is from a letter my Uncle Tommy wrote to his parents in February 1971, just a month before he disappeared. He never had the chance to send it. David cleared his throat and began to read Tommy's words, written in a foxhole 50 years ago but speaking directly to the hearts of everyone present. Dear Mum and Dad, I know you worry about me over here, but I want you to know that I'm not facing this alone. My friend Hank Morrison from Iowa has become the brother I never had. He's taught me that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you are scared. When this war is over, I'm going to visit his family's farm. He says the corn grows 10 feet tall and the soil is so rich. It's almost black. He says his mother makes apple pie that could make a grown man weep with joy. I want to help with the harvest, learn to drive a tractor, maybe stay for Christmas if they'll have me. Most of all, I want you to meet the man who's kept me alive over here, who's shown me that friendship is the strongest armor a soldier can wear. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of weeping throughout the sanctuary. David folded the letter carefully, his own eyes bright with tears. My uncle never made it to Iowa the way he planned, David continued, his voice stronger now. But through the mystery of how these artifacts found their way to Mr. Morrison's farm, through the love of a dog who somehow knew where to dig, and through the dedication of people who refused to let the past stay buried, Tommy Chen has finally come home to the place he dreamed about visiting. When David returned to his seat, Hank rose on unsteady legs and walked to the podium. The eulogy he'd spent days perfecting suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of 500 expectant faces, but the words came from a place deeper than preparation. 50 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary's acoustics, I made a promise to my best friend, Tommy Chen. I promised that we'd watch each other's backs, that we'd make sure we both came home from Vietnam to build the lives we'd planned. Hank paused, looking out at the sea of faces, veterans who understood the weight of such promises, families who knew the cost of keeping them. For 50 years, I believed I'd broken that promise. I carried the guilt of failing Tommy when he needed me most. I thought I'd left him behind in a jungle on the other side of the world. His voice grew stronger as he continued, the truth finally given voice after decades of silence. But this week, I learned something that changed everything. Tommy didn't stay in that jungle. He came home after all, just not in the way either of us expected. He's been resting in Iowa soil, waiting patiently for me to find him. And when I did, when my dog Boone somehow led me to his grave, Tommy gave me the greatest gift imaginable. He gave me forgiveness for a failure that existed only in my own mind. The congregation was absolutely still, hanging on every word as Hank shared the story of discovery and redemption that had brought them all together. Tommy Chen was a hero, Hank concluded, his voice breaking with emotion, not just because he earned a bronze star, but because he showed all of us that love transcends death, that friendship survives even the worst circumstances, and that some promises take 50 years to keep but are worth waiting for. The procession to Graceland Cemetery stretched for more than a mile, a slow-moving river of cars with headlights burning in the afternoon sun. Hank rode in the lead vehicle with David Chen, watching through the windshield as the landscape he'd known his entire life took on new meaning. Every hill, every farmhouse, every grove of trees now existed in a world where Tommy had found his way home. At the cemetery, the crowd gathered around the grave that would soon bear Tommy's correct name. The Granite Headstone Company had worked through the night to prepare the new marker, a simple but dignified monument that would replace the mistaken identity with the truth that had waited 50 years to be acknowledged. Colonel Martinez stepped forward with a team of military personnel, their dress uniforms crisp in the autumn air. The ceremony to correct military records was brief but profound, an official acknowledgement of bureaucratic error and a commitment to honoring the truth, however long it took to emerge. By the vested in me by the United States Army and the Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command, Colonel Martinez announced, I hereby correct the military records of Private First Class Thomas M. Chen, confirming his identity and his heroic service to our nation. The honor guard removed the covering from the new headstone, revealing Tommy's name carved in permanent granite. Thomas M. Chen, 1949-1971, beloved son, uncle, and brother-in-arms. Below his name, they had engraved the bronze star with V device, ensuring that his courage would be remembered by every visitor to the grave. Hank approached the headstone with the wooden cross he'd carved in 1971, his hands steady now after decades of trembling. He placed it gently at the base of the stone, next to a spray of wildflowers that Sarah and Dr. Elise had gathered from the oak grove where Boone had made his miraculous discovery. I kept my promise, Tommy, he whispered, his words carried away by the Iowa wind. I brought you home. David Chen stepped forward with his own offering, a small American flag, and a photograph of Tommy's extended family, including nieces and nephews who had grown up hearing stories about their missing uncle. From all of us who loved you, he said simply. The honor guard performed the ritual of military honors with precision born of respect and practice. 7 rifles fired 3 volleys into the clear sky, the sharp cracks echoing across the rolling hills like thunder. A lone trumpeter played taps, the haunting melody rising and falling with the autumn wind, each note a tribute to a young life cut short but not forgotten. When the last note faded, something extraordinary happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice began singing Amazing Grace, tentative at first, then joined by others until hundreds of voices created a harmony that seemed to embrace the entire cemetery. Veterans and civilians, young and old, strangers who had become family through shared witness to this moment of grace and redemption. Boone, who had been sitting quietly beside Hank throughout the ceremony, suddenly stood and walked to Tommy's grave. The dog placed his nose against the new headstone, his tail wagging slowly, as if greeting an old friend. Then he returned to Hank's side and settled with a contented sigh, his work finally complete. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, small groups formed around the grave to pay individual respects. Veterans shared stories of their own service, families offered condolences to David and his relatives, and children asked their grandparents to explain what it meant to be a hero. Dr. Elise found Hank standing apart from the crowd, watching as visitors approached Tommy's grave with flowers, flags, and personal mementos. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. "Different," he replied honestly. "Lighter somehow. Like I've been carrying a weight for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Trauma has a way of bending us out of shape," she said. "Sometimes healing means learning to trust our true memories instead of our fears." Sarah approached with David Chen, both of them carrying bouquets of prairie flowers that matched the ones now decorating Tommy's grave. "The family wants to come back for Christmas," Sarah told her father. "They'd like to see the farm, maybe." "Stay for a week," Hank nodded, imagining his quiet farmhouse filled with the voices and laughter Tommy had dreamed about experiencing 50 years ago. "They're welcome any time. That was always the plan." As the sun began to set over the Iowa countryside, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the last visitors paid their respects and departed. Hank remained beside the grave with Boone, Sarah, and Dr. Elise, watching darkness claim the cemetery with gentle inevitability. "We should head home," Sarah said eventually. "It's been a long day." But Hank wasn't ready to leave yet. For 50 years, he'd avoided this place, afraid of confronting memories that he believed would destroy him. Now, he understood that some encounters with the past weren't about destruction. They were about completion, about honoring what was lost while embracing what remained. "Give me a few more minutes," he said. "I have some things to tell him." The others understood and walked back toward the cars, leaving Hank alone with his friend for the first time since 1971. In the gathering darkness, he began to speak, not to a grave, but to a presence he could finally acknowledge without fear or guilt. 6 months later, the oak grove looked different in the spring light. Where Boone had once dug frantically for buried secrets, wildflowers now grew in profusion, black-eyed Susans and prairie grass, purple coneflowers and native sage. The disturbed earth had healed itself with new life, as if Tommy's story had somehow enriched the very soil. Hank sat on the front porch with his morning coffee, watching David Chen teach his teenage daughters how to collect eggs from the chicken coop. The girls giggled at the hens' indignant squawking, their city reflexes no match for the quick movements of irritated poultry. David himself had taken to farm life with the same enthusiasm his uncle had expressed in his letters, spending his spring break learning to operate a tractor and helping with the planting. "Uncle Hank, the red hen won't let me near her nest," called 15-year-old Amy, David's youngest daughter. Somewhere along the way, the Chen family had adopted him as the honorary uncle Tommy had planned to introduce them to 50 years ago. "That's Henrietta," Hank replied, setting down his coffee cup. "She's protective of her eggs, but if you approach from the left side and talk to her gentle-like, she'll settle down." The transformation in his daily routine still amazed him. Where once his farmhouse had echoed with solitude, it now regularly filled with voices. David's family visiting from California, Sarah driving down from Chicago more weekends than not, Dr. Elise stopping by most evenings to share dinner and conversation. The isolation that had defined his life after Margaret's death had been replaced by connections he'd never expected to find again. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh muffins, her corporate wardrobe replaced by jeans and one of her mother's old aprons. She'd taken a sabbatical from her investment firm to help establish the Veterans Trauma Recovery Center that had grown out of Tommy's story. What started as one man's journey to understand his buried guilt had become a community effort to support other veterans struggling with similar wounds. Dr. Martinez called, she announced, settling into the chair beside him. "The DNA results are official. James McKinney's family finally has closure too. They're planning their own memorial service. Next month." The ripple effects of Tommy's discovery continued to spread. 3 other misidentified burials had been corrected as a result of the investigation, reuniting families with their loved ones and ensuring that military honors went to the right graves. Colonel Martinez had told them it was the most significant breakthrough in MIA identification his unit had seen in years. "Any word from the documentary crew?" Hank asked. "They'll be here Thursday to film the final interviews." The producer says Tommy's story represents something important about how trauma affects memory and how healing can happen even decades after loss. Hank nodded, still adjusting to the attention their story had generated. The documentary would premiere on Veterans Day, sharing Tommy's journey with a national audience. More importantly, it would highlight the work being done at the recovery center, potentially helping other veterans find the support they needed. Dr. Elise arrived as the Chen girls were finishing their egg collection, Boone trotting alongside her with his usual enthusiasm for visitors. The dog had become something of a local celebrity since the memorial service, with veterinary journals publishing articles about his uncanny ability to locate buried artifacts. Dr. Elise had her own theory about what had driven Boone's digging. A combination of scent memory and the mysterious connections that sometimes exist between animals and human emotions. "How's our famous archaeologist today?" she asked, scratching behind Boone's ears. "Retired from the artifact recovery business," Hank replied with a smile. "These days, he's more interested in chasing rabbits and supervising the chickens." They gathered around the kitchen table for lunch, the same surface where Tommy's belongings had first been displayed now covered with everyday dishes and the comfortable clutter of family life. The framed combat photograph held a place of honor on the windowsill, showing two young soldiers whose friendship had transcended death to bring healing to everyone around them. David showed them pictures on his phone from his uncle's grave, where fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by visitors who had heard the story and been moved by it. Tommy Chen had become a symbol of the unaccounted-for soldiers whose stories remained untold, their sacrifices honored by strangers who understood the cost of service. "I've been thinking about something," David said, scrolling through the images. "My uncle always wanted to be a teacher. In a way, he's teaching people now about memory, about healing, about the importance of never giving up on the missing." After lunch, Hank walked his property with Boone, following the familiar routes that had once been a solitary meditation, but had become a celebration of all the life that filled his days. The cornfield stretched green and promising toward the horizon, the cattle grazed contentedly in the pasture, and the oak grove rustled with the secret conversations of leaves and wind. At Tommy's original discovery site, someone had placed a small memorial plaque in memory of PFC Thomas M. Chen and all who serve. Their sacrifice is not forgotten. Wildflowers surrounded the marker, planted and tended by community volunteers who had adopted Tommy's story as their own. Hank paused beside the memorial, as he did every day, not from guilt or obligation, but from gratitude. Tommy had kept his promise too, in his way. He had found the farm he'd dreamed about, had brought his family to meet the people he'd loved, had created connections that enriched everyone they touched. "Thank you," Hank said quietly, words carried on the Iowa wind that had witnessed 50 years of secrets and revelations, "for coming home, for bringing all of us together, for showing me that some stories don't end. They just wait for the right time to continue." Boone wagged his tail and pressed against Hank's leg, his work complete but his loyalty eternal. In the distance, voices called from the farmhouse, Sarah coordinating dinner preparations, the Chen girls laughing at some shared joke, Dr. Elise's gentle questions about everyone's day. The sun was setting over the Iowa landscape, painting the sky in the same shades of hope that had welcomed Hank home from Vietnam 50 years ago. But this time, he wasn't alone with his memories. This time, he was surrounded by the family that war and loss and miraculous discovery had created. A family that included a friend who had never stopped believing in the power of promises kept and love that transcends all boundaries, even death itself.